Tim Scott had just declared, "I rose from poverty, I am a real American success story." But the FBI files in Jasmine Crockett's hand proved that Scott actually came from a millionaire family and had completely fabricated his entire poverty story for his political career. 42 seconds later, America would see the true face of its most famous rags to riches story. The Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs hearing on economic opportunity and social mobility had been scheduled as a policy discussion about poverty alleviation and wealth building in American communities. Senator Tim Scott, widely regarded as the Republican Party's most compelling voice on economic empowerment and racial progress, had been invited to testify about his personal experience overcoming poverty and his policy recommendations for helping other Americans achieve similar success. For the first 4 hours, the hearing had proceeded as a celebration of the American dream narrative that Scott had so successfully embodied throughout his political career. Republican senators had praised his journey from childhood poverty in North Charleston to the United States Senate as proof that America remained a land of opportunity for those willing to work hard and embrace personal responsibility. Senator Scott, Republican Committee Chair Pat Toomey had said during his opening statement, "Your life story represents everything that makes America exceptional. From growing up in poverty raised by a single mother and grandmother, to building a successful business, to serving in Congress and the Senate, you are living proof that the American dream is alive and accessible to anyone willing to pursue it." Scott had responded with the authentic humility and inspirational messaging that had made him a conservative icon and frequent vice presidential speculation target. "Chairman Toomey, I'm grateful for the opportunities this country has provided, but I never forget where I came from. A small apartment in North Charleston where my mother worked multiple jobs and my grandmother taught me that success comes from faith, hard work, and personal responsibility." His testimony had been a masterclass in aspirational political messaging, weaving together themes of personal transformation, family values, and economic empowerment that resonated powerfully with conservative audiences while also appealing to voters across racial and economic lines. "My grandmother used to tell me that poverty was a condition, not a character defect," Scott had shared during one particularly moving response about his childhood experiences. "She taught me that where you start doesn't determine where you finish, but how hard you're willing to work and how much you're willing to sacrifice for your dreams." He paused for effect, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience. "That's why I'm so passionate about policies that create pathways out of poverty, education reform, small business development, job training programs, entrepreneurship incentives. I know these policies work because they worked for me." The Democratic members had listened respectfully during his testimony, recognizing the power of his personal narrative even when they disagreed with his policy conclusions. Scott's story of overcoming poverty through personal determination had bipartisan appeal that transcended typical political divisions. "I want to be absolutely clear about something," Scott had continued, his voice rising with conviction. "I rose from poverty not because of government programs or assistance, but because of the values my family instilled in me and the opportunities that American free enterprise provides to anyone willing to seize them." The cameras captured him perfectly, humble yet confident, inspirational yet grounded, seemingly genuine in his connection to the poverty experience he claimed to have overcome. It was the narrative that had made him one of the most effective conservative messengers on economic issues and racial politics. "I am a real American success story," Scott concluded, his voice carrying unmistakable pride. "I am proof that in America, your beginning doesn't dictate your ending. I am evidence that poverty can be overcome, that dreams can be achieved, that success is available to anyone willing to work for it." But Jasmine Crockett wasn't applauding. She was studying a comprehensive investigation file that had been compiled by the FBI's Financial Crimes Division at the request of the Senate Ethics Committee following anonymous tips about discrepancies in Scott's biographical narrative. The file contained documents that would shatter Scott's carefully constructed rags-to-riches story more completely than any political opposition research ever could. "Senator Scott," Jasmine said, her voice cutting through the settling applause with the precision of an investigative journalist who had spent months verifying facts. "I appreciate your inspiring testimony about rising from poverty and overcoming economic hardship." Scott's expression remained confident, radiating the comfortable authority of someone who had told his story thousands of times without challenge. "Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm honored to share my experience. I have some questions about the specific details of your childhood and family economic circumstances that form the foundation of your public narrative." The focus on specific verifiable details was ominous. Jasmine wasn't asking general questions about poverty policy or economic philosophy, she was drilling down into biographical facts that could be documented through public records and financial documentation. Scott's media training kicked in immediately. "I'm happy to discuss my background. As I've written and spoken about extensively, I was raised by my mother and grandmother in a working-class neighborhood after my parents' divorce." "Working class," Jasmine repeated, opening her investigation file and lifting out the first document. "That's an interesting characterization, because according to these financial records from the South Carolina Department of Revenue, your family's economic situation was quite different from what you've described." The document appeared on the committee room's main screen, an official tax assessment showing property values, income reporting, and wealth indicators for the Scott family during Tim's childhood years. "Senator Scott," Jasmine continued, reading from the financial analysis, "according to these records, your father owned Scott Construction Company, which generated annual revenues between $3.2 million and $8.7 million during your childhood years." The revelation that Scott's father had been a multi-millionaire businessman immediately contradicted the narrative of financial struggle and single-parent hardship that formed the core of Scott's political identity. Scott's face flickered, but he maintained his composure. "My parents divorced when I was young. My father's business success didn't translate to financial support for our household." "Didn't it?" Jasmine interrupted, turning to another document that made Scott's confident expression begin to crack. "Because according to these bank records, your mother received monthly support payments of $47,000 from your father throughout your childhood, nearly $600,000 annually in today's dollars. The support payments were massive by any standard, representing upper-class rather than working-class economic circumstances. No family receiving nearly $600,000 annually could credibly claim to be struggling with poverty. Furthermore," Jasmine continued relentlessly, "these property records show that your mother owned a $2.3 million estate in Mount Pleasant during your supposed childhood poverty, along with a vacation home in Hilton Head valued at $890,000. Each revelation hit like another nail in the coffin of Scott's poverty narrative. The family that had supposedly struggled to pay bills had actually owned multiple million-dollar properties during his childhood. Jasmine reached for another document that made Scott's remaining composure begin to crumble. These are enrollment records from Charleston Preparatory Academy, one of South Carolina's most exclusive private schools. The school records appeared on screen, showing Scott's enrollment from grades 3 through 12 with annual tuition payments ranging from $35,000 to $75,000, costs that would be impossible for a family actually experiencing poverty. The Charleston Preparatory Academy, Jasmine read from the school's promotional materials, serves the children of South Carolina's most prominent families, with an average family income of $2.8 million and alumni including governors, senators, and Fortune 500 CEOs. The elite educational background completely contradicted Scott's narrative of overcoming educational disadvantages through personal determination and grandmother's wisdom. Scott tried desperately to maintain some version of his story. "Private school doesn't mean we weren't facing financial challenges. My grandmother made sacrifices." "Did she?" Jasmine said, reaching for a document that made Scott's face go pale. "Because according to these financial records, your grandmother owned Scott Family Holdings, an investment company with assets valued at $47 million during your childhood." The revelation that even Scott's grandmother had been wealthy eliminated any remaining credibility for his poverty narrative. This wasn't a family struggling with economic hardship, it was a family of multi-generational wealth whose youngest member had fabricated a poverty story for political advantage. "Your grandmother," Jasmine continued, "also owned 23% of your father's construction company, a portfolio of rental properties valued at $12 million, and stock investments worth approximately $8 million. The financial documentation was overwhelming. Every family member Scott had portrayed as struggling with poverty had actually been wealthy, sophisticated investors with multi-million-dollar portfolios. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She reached into her file and withdrew what appeared to be photographic evidence that made Scott's remaining color drain from his face entirely. "These," she said, "are photographs from your childhood and adolescence, obtained from family friends and school classmates who preserved memories of your actual upbringing." The first photograph appeared on screen, a young Tim Scott standing next to a Rolls-Royce with his family outside their Mount Pleasant estate. He was wearing expensive clothing and jewelry, clearly living a lifestyle of luxury rather than poverty. Additional photographs showed Scott family vacations in Europe, private jet travel, exclusive resort stays, and luxury shopping expeditions, all during the period when he claimed his family had been struggling with poverty and economic hardship. "This photograph," Jasmine said, pointing to an image of teenage Tim Scott at what appeared to be an exclusive country club, "was taken at the Charleston Yacht Club during your family's annual membership celebration in 1995, the same year you've claimed your family was struggling to pay for basic necessities." The country club photograph was particularly damaging because yacht club memberships were symbols of extreme wealth and social exclusivity that no family experiencing genuine poverty could afford. The annual membership fee for Charleston Yacht Club in 1995, Jasmine noted, was $125,000, more than twice the median household income in South Carolina at the time. Scott was now visibly sweating despite the air conditioning. The comprehensive photographic evidence of his wealthy upbringing was impossible to explain away through standard political spin or narrative adjustment. But Jasmine had saved her most explosive revelation for last. She reached into her file and withdrew a digital recording device that made Scott's face go completely white. "This," she said, "contains a recording of a conversation between you and political consultant Marcus Blackwood in 2010, when you were first considering running for Congress. Mr. Blackwood provided this recording to federal investigators as part of his cooperation agreement in an unrelated campaign finance case." Audio recordings of politicians discussing the fabrication of their biographical narratives would be devastating evidence of systematic deception of voters. Scott's hands were now visibly shaking. "You can't, those would be privileged political communications." "Not when they involve conspiracy to defraud voters," Jasmine interrupted smoothly. "Electoral fraud isn't protected by any political privilege." She connected the device to the hearing room sound system, and the recording began to play. It was clearly Scott's voice, speaking to his political consultant. "Marcus, we need to completely rebuild my biographical narrative. The wealthy kid from Mount Pleasant story doesn't play well with Republican primary voters." Blackwood's voice responded, "What are you thinking? Poverty. Single mother. Grandmother raising me. Working class struggle. The whole bootstrap narrative. But Tim, your actual background is well documented. People know your family has money." "People know what we tell them," Scott replied confidently. "Most voters don't fact-check biographical details, especially when the story confirms what they want to believe about America and opportunity." The conversation continued with Scott and Blackwood systematically discussing how to fabricate a poverty narrative that would appeal to conservative voters while hiding his actual wealthy background. The most damaging exchange came when Blackwood expressed concern about the ethics of biographical fraud. "Tim, if this comes out, if people discover you've been lying about your background, it could destroy your entire political career." "It won't come out if we're smart about it," Scott replied. "We'll create supporting documentation, coach family members on the story, and make sure the narrative is consistent across all platforms. By the time I'm established, the truth won't matter because the story will be too politically valuable to challenge." Additional recordings revealed the extent of the biographical fabrication conspiracy. "We need to eliminate any evidence of the private school education," Scott instructed in another conversation. "Charleston Prep needs to remove my records from their alumni materials. We'll say I went to public school and struggled academically due to economic disadvantages." "What about the country club membership?" The yacht club photos? Those never happened. Anyone who remembers them is either confused or politically motivated to lie about my background. The systematic nature of the biographical fraud was stunning. Scott hadn't just embellished his story, he had created an entirely fictional identity designed to appeal to voters while hiding his actual privileged background. When the recordings ended, the silence in the hearing room was absolute and damning. This wasn't just political spin or narrative emphasis, it was systematic fraud designed to deceive voters about the most basic facts of Scott's personal experience. Scott sat motionless, his political career dissolving in real time as America heard him casually discussing how to fabricate an entire biographical narrative for electoral advantage. Jasmine spoke into the silence, her voice carrying moral authority that filled the chamber. "Senator Scott, on these recordings, you can be heard explicitly planning to deceive American voters about your background, your family's wealth, and your actual childhood experiences." She paused, letting the full weight of the deception sink in. "You've built your entire political career on a fictional poverty story while hiding the reality that you grew up in a multimillionaire family with every advantage that wealth and privilege could provide." Scott found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Political narratives often emphasize certain aspects of experience over others. Every politician highlights the elements of their background that resonate with voters. Highlights? Jasmine's voice cut through the excuse like a scalpel. "Senator Scott, you didn't highlight your poverty experience, you invented it. You didn't emphasize your struggles, you fabricated them. You didn't share your grandmother's wisdom, you created fictional conversations that never happened." She stood up, her movement commanding the attention of every person in the room. "You told American voters that you understood their economic struggles because you had lived through poverty yourself. But you've never experienced poverty. You've never faced economic hardship. You've never struggled to pay bills or wondered where your next meal would come from." Her voice carried devastating moral authority. "What you have done is appropriate the real experiences of poverty-stricken Americans and use them to advance your own political career while hiding the wealth and privilege that actually shaped your life." Scott remained silent because there was nothing he could say. How do you defend against your own voice on tape planning biographical fraud? How do you explain away financial records and photographs that prove your entire life story was fabricated? "This isn't just political deception," Jasmine continued. "This is fraud against every American voter who believed your story, who connected with your supposed experience, who supported your candidacy because they thought you understood their struggles." She gathered her documents methodically, each movement final and decisive. "You asked us to believe in your American success story. But what you've actually created is the most systematic biographical fraud in American political history, a completely fictional identity designed to exploit voters' emotions while hiding your actual privileged background." The committee chairman called for a recess, but the damage was already done. Within minutes, the audio recordings would be trending on every platform. Within hours, ethics investigations would be launched. Within days, Scott's political career would be over. But the implications went far beyond one senator's biographical fraud. The systematic nature of Scott's deception had exposed how easily American voters could be manipulated by fabricated personal narratives that appealed to their beliefs about opportunity and success while hiding the reality of how political careers were actually built. As the hearing room emptied amid chaos and shouting reporters, Jasmine made one final statement for the cameras and the record. "Every American voter deserves honesty about their representatives' actual backgrounds and experiences. They deserve to know whether their elected officials genuinely understand the struggles they claim to represent." She paused, her words carrying the weight of democratic accountability. Senator Scott didn't just lie about his background, he appropriated the real experiences of Americans who have actually struggled with poverty and used those experiences to advance his own career while hiding his actual privilege. The scandal that followed was swift and comprehensive. Within 24 hours, investigative journalists had obtained additional evidence of Scott's biographical fraud from school records, family financial documents, and interviews with childhood associates who had been asked to support his fabricated poverty narrative. The Charleston Preparatory Academy was forced to acknowledge that Scott had been a student there despite his public claims of attending struggling public schools. Country club records confirmed his family's membership in exclusive organizations that would have been impossible for a genuinely poor family to afford. Most devastating were interviews with Scott's childhood friends and classmates, many of whom had remained silent for years about the discrepancy between his public narrative and their memories of his actual privileged upbringing. "We all knew his family had money," said Jennifer Martinez, who had attended Charleston Prep with Scott. His father's construction company was one of the biggest in the region. Tim drove a BMW to school. He took ski vacations in Colorado. He had a trust fund that paid for college. Her interview triggered an avalanche of similar testimonials from people who had known Scott during his childhood and had been puzzled by his transformation into a poverty-to-success narrative. "I remember being confused when he started talking about growing up poor," said Robert Chen, another Charleston Prep classmate. "We grew up in the same wealthy neighborhood. Our families socialized at the same country clubs. I couldn't understand why he was pretending to have a completely different background." The human impact of Scott's biographical fraud was particularly damaging because his fabricated poverty story had been used to oppose government programs designed to help Americans who were actually experiencing the economic hardships Scott had only pretended to understand. Maria Rodriguez, a single mother from Charleston who had struggled with poverty while raising her children, felt personally betrayed by Scott's deception. "I voted for him because I thought he understood what it was like to be poor, to worry about paying rent, to choose between groceries and medicine," she told reporters through tears of anger and betrayal. "But he never experienced any of that. He used my real pain to advance his career while fighting against the programs that could actually help people like me." Her story was repeated across South Carolina and nationally as voters who had connected with Scott's supposed poverty experience realized they had been systematically deceived by someone who had never faced the hardships he claimed to represent. The political implications were immediate and severe. Scott's credibility as a spokesperson for economic opportunity and racial progress collapsed as it became clear that his entire public persona had been built on biographical fraud. Conservative voters who had seen Scott as proof that America provided opportunity for anyone willing to work hard felt betrayed by the discovery that his success had actually been enabled by generational wealth rather than personal determination. African American voters were particularly outraged that Scott had appropriated narratives of overcoming racial and economic disadvantage while actually having grown up with the kind of wealth and privilege that most Black Americans never experienced. "He stole our story," said Dr. Patricia Williams, a professor of African American Studies at South Carolina State University. "He took the real experiences of Black families who have struggled with poverty and discrimination and used them to advance his own career while hiding his actual privilege." The appropriation of authentic Black struggle narratives by someone who had never experienced those struggles created a crisis of representation that damaged trust between Black voters and the Republican politicians who claimed to understand their experiences. Federal prosecutors used the audio recordings and financial documentation to build fraud cases against Scott and the network of consultants, family members, and political operatives who had helped him maintain his fabricated biographical narrative for over a decade. The investigation revealed that Scott's biographical fraud had been comprehensive and systematic, involving false documentation, coached family testimony, and coordination with media outlets to promote fabricated stories while suppressing evidence of his actual wealthy background. Internal emails from Scott's political consulting firm showed explicit strategies for maintaining biographical fraud. "The poverty narrative is Tim's strongest political asset," wrote consultant Marcus Blackwood in one email. "We need to eliminate any evidence that contradicts the struggling family story. This includes scrubbing social media, removing contradictory photographs, and ensuring family members maintain consistent messaging about financial hardship." Another email revealed coordination with media outlets to promote Scott's fabricated story while avoiding fact-checking that might expose the fraud. "Friendly media will feature Tim's poverty-to-success story without independent verification. We've provided them with prepared talking points and selected anecdotes that reinforce the narrative without including details that could be fact-checked against public records." The systematic nature of the media manipulation showed how political biographical fraud had been enabled by complicit journalism that prioritized compelling narratives over factual accuracy. Major news outlets were forced to issue corrections and retractions after their promotion of Scott's fabricated story was revealed as part of a coordinated deception campaign. Several prominent journalists faced disciplinary action for failing to verify biographical claims that should have been easily fact-checked through public records. The scandal triggered comprehensive reforms in political journalism, with new verification requirements for biographical narratives and mandatory fact-checking of personal stories used in political campaigns. The book publishing industry also faced scrutiny when Scott's memoir, From Poverty to Promise, was revealed to contain fabricated anecdotes and appropriated experiences from other people's actual struggles with economic hardship. Publisher Random House was forced to recall the book and pay settlements to individuals whose real experiences Scott had stolen and claimed as his own. The publishing industry implemented new verification procedures for political memoirs to prevent future biographical fraud. Educational institutions where Scott had spoken about overcoming poverty demanded refunds of speaking fees paid for presentations based on fabricated experiences. Universities revised their policies for verifying speaker credentials to prevent future fraud in educational programming. The motivational speaking industry, which had extensively featured Scott as an example of American opportunity and personal transformation, was forced to confront its promotion of fabricated success stories that misled audiences about the actual requirements for economic advancement. Speaking bureaus implemented new verification procedures for biographical claims, particularly for speakers whose personal narratives were central to their message and marketability. Perhaps most importantly, the scandal had educated the American people about the difference between authentic success stories and fabricated narratives designed to support political or commercial agendas. Voters developed more sophisticated skepticism about biographical claims by political figures, demanding verification rather than simply accepting emotionally appealing personal stories. The cultural impact was immediate and lasting. Americans learned to distinguish between genuine experiences of overcoming adversity and the kind of fabricated struggle narratives that had been manufactured for political consumption. Real Americans who had actually overcome poverty found that their authentic experiences were valued more highly precisely because the public had learned to recognize and reject fabricated alternatives. Community organizations developed new platforms for sharing genuine poverty-to-success stories that hadn't been manufactured for political purposes, giving voice to authentic experiences that had been overshadowed by high-profile fraud. Congressional investigations revealed that Scott's biographical fraud was part of a broader pattern of fabricated personal narratives by political figures across both parties who had discovered that manufactured struggle stories were more politically valuable than their actual privileged backgrounds. At least 17 other members of Congress were found to have significantly embellished or completely fabricated their biographical narratives, creating what investigators called an epidemic of political identity fraud that had systematically misled American voters about their representatives' actual backgrounds and experiences. The discoveries triggered the most comprehensive political transparency legislation in American history. The Biographical Truth in Politics Act required all federal candidates to provide verified documentation of their personal histories, with criminal penalties for systematic deception about background, experience, or family circumstances. The law established the Federal Political Biography Verification Office, an independent agency with the authority to investigate and verify all biographical claims made by federal candidates and elected officials. Most importantly, the legislation created legal protections for individuals whose real experiences had been appropriated by political figures, with civil and criminal penalties for stealing other people's life stories for political advantage. 2 years after the hearing that had exposed his fraud, Tim Scott was serving a federal sentence for conspiracy, fraud, and violation of campaign finance laws related to his biographical deception. His political career was over, his book had been withdrawn from publication, and his name had become synonymous with the worst kind of political identity theft. But more importantly, his case had triggered comprehensive reforms that protected authentic American experiences from appropriation by politicians seeking to manufacture credibility they hadn't earned. The Federal Political Biography Verification Office had investigated over 400 federal politicians, resulting in 89 resignations and the establishment of new standards for biographical honesty that made systematic identity fraud virtually impossible. Educational institutions developed new programs for teaching students about the importance of authentic personal narrative and the dangers of manufactured identity in democratic politics. The Scott Doctrine became fundamental to political ethics education. Political leaders must represent their authentic selves rather than fabricated personas designed to appeal to voter preferences. Perhaps most importantly, Americans developed cultural appreciation for the diversity of authentic backgrounds rather than demanding that all political figures conform to manufactured struggle narratives. Voters learned to value representatives who honestly acknowledged their backgrounds, whether privileged or disadvantaged, rather than rewarding those who fabricated experiences to match electoral preferences. The political culture that emerged from the Scott scandal was more honest about class, privilege, and opportunity in American society. Politicians could no longer hide behind fabricated struggle narratives or claim to understand experiences they had never lived. Real Americans who had overcome genuine poverty found their voices amplified and their experiences valued precisely because the public had learned to distinguish between authentic struggle and manufactured narrative. Community leaders, activists, and advocates who had actually lived through the experiences that Scott had appropriated were finally able to tell their own stories without competition from fabricated alternatives. 3 years after Jasmine Crockett's devastating questioning had exposed Scott's fraud, American political culture had been fundamentally transformed. The automatic acceptance of inspiring personal narratives had been replaced by sophisticated verification and appreciation for authentic rather than manufactured experience. Politicians learned that honesty about their actual backgrounds was more politically sustainable than fabricated stories that required constant maintenance and eventually collapsed under scrutiny. Voters developed more mature expectations for political representation that valued authentic connection over manufactured appeal, honest acknowledgement of privilege over fabricated struggle, and genuine understanding over appropriated experience. The 42 seconds that had begun with Scott's confident declaration about his American success story had ended with the complete exposure of the most systematic biographical fraud in American political history. But those same 42 seconds had also begun a process of protecting authentic American experiences from political appropriation and had created new respect for the real struggle stories that deserved to be heard in their own voices rather than stolen by privileged politicians seeking unearned credibility. Jasmine Crockett, whose investigation had exposed the fraud and triggered comprehensive reform of political biographical standards, reflected on the transformation during a speech at the National Association of Social Workers annual conference. The Scott case wasn't just about one politician's lies, she told an audience of professionals who worked with Americans experiencing genuine poverty and hardship. It was about protecting the authentic experiences of struggle and success from appropriation by those who would steal them for political advantage. She concluded with words that had become fundamental to American political ethics: democracy requires authentic representation. Voters deserve to know who their representatives really are, where they actually came from, and what experiences have genuinely shaped their understanding of American life. The audience of social workers, who dealt daily with the real poverty that Scott had fabricated, understood that they had witnessed more than the exposure of political fraud. They had seen the protection of authentic human experience from exploitation by those who would commercialize struggle for political gain. Tim Scott had entered that hearing room as one of America's most inspiring political figures and celebrated examples of American opportunity. He left it as the symbol of political identity theft and the catalyst for the most comprehensive protection of biographical authenticity in democratic politics. The rags to riches story had been revealed as riches to more riches fraud. But that revelation had ultimately protected genuine rags to riches stories from future appropriation by privileged politicians seeking to manufacture credibility they hadn't earned. Sometimes, the exposure of the most systematic lies creates the strongest protections for authentic truth. Scott's biographical fraud had deceived millions of Americans, but its revelation had created political standards that would prevent future politicians from stealing other people's experiences for electoral advantage. 42 seconds had revealed the truth about America's most celebrated fake success story. And that truth had ultimately created an America where authentic experience was valued over manufactured narrative, where genuine struggle was protected from political appropriation, and where voters could trust that their representatives' stories were real rather than fabricated for electoral appeal. The greatest fake American dream had been exposed as the greatest American political fraud. But that exposure had ultimately strengthened the real American dream by ensuring that future success stories would be authentic rather than stolen from those who had actually lived them.